improve diversity inclusion and make sure it's meaningful within the university?
So what we've tried to do, and indeed most Scottish universities have tried to do this, is to make our campuses a good deal more global. And that's really to give, you know, young people in Scotland an experience that is more like the world they're going to live and work in. A chance not just to, we talk about bringing the world to Scotland, but also taking Scotland to the world. And one of the challenges will be post-pandemic, how do we hold on to that? We've obviously been thinking very hard as what does green internationalisation look like? Climate change was already posing quite profound questions. And I suppose if I was to sum it up, it would be that, well, we do have to think, you know, city breaks by EasyJet that, you know, are flying. Living in another country and using that great Burns phrase, to see ourselves as others see us, is a life-changing experience. And if you're spending 6 months or a year abroad, it changes who you are and it changes how you see the world. And so that's some of what's going on, the mix at the moment of how we hold on to the best of globalization and internationalization whilst owning the challenges around climate change in terms of how we use resources.
And you also have a role at the moment as part of working with Scottish Government as a trade envoy. And obviously there's been significant impacts during COVID on the economy and our ability to trade internationally and work internationally. What have you seen there at the moment, and what are your kind of thoughts and hopes for how we can weather the storm, see our way through this?
So being a trade envoy is really about boosting exports, which sounds incredibly dull. And to the Scottish Government's credit, the reason why they have, I really work in the area of higher education, is to say that if you look at history, governments tend to overestimate their hard power. You know, we can go to war, we can fight, but they underestimate their soft power, i.e. people and connections. So if you think about being a trade envoy, 20 years ago when I was in government, same time as when we were setting up Social Investment Scotland, one of the other things we set up was a network called Global Scot, which was the first attempt to bring, really to learn from the Irish and the way that they had tapped into their diaspora globally. We tried to set up a network of Scots around the world. And if you think about how the world has changed, Scotland's future network isn't about a few expatriates who live abroad. It's about the thousands of people from all over the world who have an education in Scotland and go back home. So it's about country nationals who have an affection for Scotland, shall we say. So it's trying to think differently about our place in the world, the importance of soft power, and how friendships transcend nationality in a global world.
And so 20 years ago, thinking about when Social Investment Scotland came about, it was a huge period of change, a huge period of excitement. Can you tell us a little bit about the start of Social Investment Scotland, the start of social investment within Scotland, and also what the possibilities were with social enterprise at that time?
So it was a long time ago. I have to say, I usually cover my grey hair, as you can see it. So
me too, Wendy.
But the antecedents of social investment, and I realise this is before probably some people on this call were born, but but it's hard to imagine how Scotland felt like in 1997. We had 18 years of Conservative government. And as people said, you know, I think one of the most powerful calling cards for the SNP was Nicola Sturgeon saying, I've never lived under a government that I would have liked to have voted for. So there've been 20 years of Mrs. Thatcher, and almost 20 years. And one of the, for all the difficulties and the pain and the brutality sometimes of deindustrialization in the 80s, one of the good things that came out of that was self-organization in communities. So when people were made redundant, there were all sorts of people who fought back in terms of saying, we want to organise in our communities. And it was self-organisation that didn't draw on perhaps the traditional sources of organisation, you know, where that trade unions or sometimes churches. It was people self-organising, and it led to a totally different view of what vehicles of charitable status were about. People who were not interested in making money, but were interested in serving their community. But they were kind of pigeonholed into a world where the legal framework really thought about making money for shareholders or Lady Bountiful. Now, in fairness, there were lots of charities that went in that space. I simplify. But that was the kind of world. And so there was this huge upsurge of interest when Labour got re-elected to say, how do we make self-organisation easier? Both legally, but also how do we support individuals who want to self-organise? And so at the same time, there were things like the School for Social Entrepreneurs being launched at exactly the same time. And the particular mission of Social Investment Scotland was, how do we make access to finance for groups of people who want to self-organise easier, because that wasn't an area in which the banks were traditionally comfortable in lending. And one of the other patrons who you have coming on is Susan Rice.
Yes.
Susan Rice and I spent a lot of time going to the US together in 1999 to look at how you banked the unbanked. How did you give people access to a bank account? We'll have the same issue coming out of COVID, you know, in a cashless society. What do you do for buying cash? So Susan was doing a lot of work on access to financial services for individuals, and Social Investment Scotland came out of trying to, how do we make access to financial resources available to those who are not big old-fashioned endowed charities, but people who want to self-organise, support their communities.
And during that time, so you've touched on coming out of the 80s, coming out of that the time when a lot of the industry closed. So I'm from Wishaw, and my dad worked in the Ravenscraig in Wishaw, and so it kind of speaks to me quite directly in terms of. So he was made redundant. He took the money from his redundancy and set up a fruit and veg van within the area. There was a great sense of entrepreneurialism around about that time, and a thirst for change. Similarly, around about that time, and there was Section 28, which overshadowed a lot of people like me within those times in Scotland who were gay and within the education system. It's Pride Week this week, can you talk to me a little bit more about that experience of making change and making change which was unpopular at some times and could have affected actually the position you had as a politician, because it wasn't necessarily a favoured change that was being made?
Oh, where to start? So the first thing is to say that the very last thing I did before lockdown literally was I got my hair cut, so it's not as grey as it is. I took gifts to my mother, and the third thing was I went to Waterstones and I bought, I'm still old-fashioned, I have a Kindle but I don't read it, and I bought Motherwell by Deborah Orr, which is all about the closing
my
of
sister. It's great.
I've read it in lockdown. I haven't read much in lockdown, but it's a brilliant book in encapsulating that moment in time in the 80s. She's not as old, she's older than you, she's the same age as me, and she's sadly now dead, and I didn't know her, but you felt like you know her if you were anyone who grew up in Scotland in the 80s.
Absolutely.
So I commend it to NMD Listing. If you're wanting some lockdown reading, try Motherwell. So Section 28. So the Parliament was established in, it met for the first time in May 1999. And there was a huge expectation. The reason for the Parliament was Scotland should be able to make its own laws. Obviously, we'd had 100 years of, more than 100 years of administrative devolution to Scotland. There had been St Andrew's House as the Scotland Office making laws for Scotland. But we used to say, you know, run by a taxi full of Tories. So the point of the Parliament was that we had a democratic institution overseeing all of those Scottish laws. And one of the things we also used to talk about, and rightly so, is that because Scotland had its own legal system, over the whole of those 100 years, you found Scottish legislation getting shoved to the back of the queue in Westminster. Just there wasn't enough time. And what that had meant was that in all the liberal legislation of a liberal, I mean in a socially liberal sense, in the 1960s about the decriminalisation of homosexuality, on issues of abortion, all of the issues that we now take for granted, which were very much the product of a Labour government in the 1960s. And Donald Dewar, who became First Minister, was very much behind all of those liberal social measures. Lots and lots of them didn't happen in Scotland on the same time scale because it needed separate legislation. And so it meant if you were a gay man, women in Scotland, but gay man, you were criminalised for longer. So that was the backdrop.
Yeah.
It then became apparent to us, and maybe this small bit of history is interesting. In September 99, so 4 months after Parliament started, John Prescott, who was then the Communities Minister, my equivalent in England, made it known to us that they were going to amend Section 28 in England because it was Labour's manifesto that this, heinous piece of legislation should go. And because in the Scottish Parliament, we had committed to be a different sort of parliament that listened to the people, we had a process of what was called pre-legislative scrutiny, that you talked to the community before you launched a bill in Parliament. I went to the Scottish Cabinet and I explained that if we wanted to repeal on the same timetable as Westminster, we had to start earlier. And so the choice for us was, now we have our own Parliament, do we want to be a laggard on all liberal legislation after, it was a test of, do we want to be behind again?
Yes.
And so it wasn't, crusading by a single woman who wanted to make a mark. The dilemma was, our colleagues in London are going to do this, and we don't want Scotland to be the laggard again. And so we're going to start, and we're going to start now. And for about 3 months, everybody was fine with it. And then we had this massive campaign of opposition orchestrated by the tabloids and some of our entrepreneurs and by the Archbishop at that time. And as they say, all the rest is history. The nice thing is that I did speak at, it was of course Pride History Month is February, and there were some lovely retrospectives in February of people reflecting that Scotland, having been so, I'm tempted to say almost ashamed of itself in retrospect around Section 28, we then have gone on to be a leader in so many of the other aspects of social legislation in a way that 20 years ago we couldn't have conceived of, and for which we should be grateful. Nobody would then have conceived that same-sex marriage, or that we would have had 3 women in the Scottish Parliament at one point, 3 gay women leaders at one point. Fantastic. So that was a moment in time.
And it certainly was. That was a moment in time in particular, but convening the Scotland Bill and overseeing the devolved financial powers to Scotland must have been like an amazingly interesting, exciting time. How did you, could you just give us a kind of overview about how you can read that? What were your obstacles? What were your challenges? And what the vision was like for a devolved Scotland with more power financially and otherwise?
So I think if you look back, the idea of a Scottish Parliament, there was a thing called the Scottish Constitutional Convention that drew up the plans for a Scottish Parliament. And that really was in the back of the defeat in the first referendum in 79. So for all of the Thatcher years, there was time to think about how did we get it right. And the parties in favour of devolution came together to get it right. I think if you look back now, 20 years on, in the scope of democratic parliaments, 20 years is quite young. It's now 21 years, but the broad outlines of how Scotland made its laws, we got right. There have been fundamentally, there has been room for Scotland to breathe around making its own legislation. And, you know, Section 28 is an example of that. And there were many others, land reform, etc. Where it was more difficult was, how did you get the financial powers right at the beginning? And the important power we gave at the beginning was the right for Scotland to raise its own income tax, a power that really until recently has hardly been used at all. That, you know, political power and financial power need to go together. Look at COVID. Out the other side, we need to decide, how do we pay for this? It's been the right thing to do. So political and financial power should go together. And I think we all knew, and indeed we said this in the white paper at the time in '97, we are on a journey around financial powers. And the Scotland Act that 10 years later I was involved in through the Calman Commission and then in the Parliament was about catching up the financial powers. Now the Parliament was 10 years old and established. And I think we'll probably see further change as a result of the amount of borrowing we've had to do and the stresses imposed by responding to COVID, and they will come. And that's right and proper in a flexible governance system.
Absolutely, and it's obviously, it's a time that we've never lived through before with COVID. It's brought some things which have been really great within communities. I suppose people coming together, that sense of organising and entrepreneurialism again. However, there will be, I guess, lasting impacts. In terms of, I suppose, the education sector, and in terms of the communities that we work in, what have you seen so far with COVID, and what would you like to see as changes within the world we live in?
So, do universities first, that's easier.
Right, sure.
And universities, I think, I mean, a lot of the people listening to this, anybody listening to this, probably works in a body that notionally is in the charitable or third sector. And that's what universities are.
Yeah.
Knowing people in the third sector, for universities, one of the huge changes has been forcing us to move online overnight. And that's been good for us. It's been hard, but it's been good for us. And I think that shift to digital will be permanent in many respects. Not that your whole student experience is online, but your professor, it ceases to be, we would call it the sage on the stage, you know, the man at the front. It's usually a man who knows it all, to the coach on the side. So the dull stuff you do by video comms, and the fun stuff you do by seminar. So I think the move online is good. I think the risk is that we cut down on face-to-face time. You know, we have to find ways. Life-changing experiences are often about engaging directly. It was once said, you know, you don't become a US Navy SEAL by watching lots of Rambo videos. You know, you got to go out and do it. You got to get fit. You don't become fit by watching videos. You have to do it. Yeah. So I think there is a bit about how we, you know, once we get into phase 2 and phase 3, and assuming there's not a second wave or post a second wave, how do we get back to allowing the life transformations that come from intimate interactions? So that's our sector. You know, great to shift us onto digital. Let's not lose the chance for people to really engage and learn and change face to face. For society as a whole, I think, you know, we're at a moment of incredible interest, because usually the things that, you know, if you look over millennia, what reduces inequality are wars and pandemics. Government acts well too, but fundamentally the experience of war and the experience of pandemics, where people see we rely on each other and we have to draw together, and you can't just paddle your own canoe, always lead to reduction in inequality historically. The political choice for us is whether we choose to use this experience to reduce inequality and tackle some of the injustices that we have seen widen in the last decade and more.
We're very aware that business has a role in tackling inequalities, as does the third sector and social enterprises. We've seen a move to from some businesses during COVID being more responsible, and responding to a moment in terms of diversity, in terms of communities, and so on. We spoke about a little bit about media before, and the zeitgeist. Now, I guess the media is going to play an important role in shaping the messages that come out through COVID and afterwards. We've seen huge changes in society like Brexit and whatever else. And unfortunately, as you said before, sometimes when there's a lack of money, it makes people sometimes more inwardly looking. I mean, it's probably quite a straightforward and maybe a silly question. In terms of the media and the media's role, what has been your experience as, I guess, a politician, and also just as someone who is a citizen, having to work with the media? Now we've got Twitter, now we've got social media, everyone has a voice. What do you think the role is, I suppose, for media and for us in messaging what we want the world to look like?
Yeah. So social media gets a bad name, and you know, when I've been trolled, I think, you know, there's a lot that's happened in terms of brutalizing people. That said, let me go back to, I talked about Section 28.
Yeah.
On Section 28, when did it get brutal and nasty? Because one tabloid editor and one person with a lot of money decided that they were going to put millions into a campaign where people were voiceless.
Yes.
And if you look back, why did 1 million people sign a petition written by the Daily Record to say don't repeal this? There was a circulation war going on between the Sun and the Record. They still thought they were both important. You know, the Record wanted to overhaul the Sun, and people who had a different view were voiceless. In the world of social media, that would never happen again, in the sense, you know, an individual tabloid editor is a lot less important now than they were then. And there are other channels for people to make their voice heard. And if I just talk about the last 24 hours, you know, my 14-year-old son and daughter, they're twins, they are outraged by what's happening in the US. Not because they sit and watch Newsnight. Occasionally they're in their bed then, or even that they watch the Channel 4 News. But, you know, they'll send me a change.org petition saying, Mummy, you must sign this, you know, you must do it now. Similarly, this morning at our executive in Dundee, we were talking about putting out a joint statement with DUSA, which channel, you know, 10 social media channels we could get it out on the issues of diversity. So I think, like social media is a tool, and it is one that offers possibilities of inclusion and voice, as well as ones of fake news and distortion. So that there are positives, definitive positives, as well as negatives, and it diminishes the power of old-fashioned press barons who through history have always had their own agenda. And there was a lot of fake news right back to press barons in, you know, early 19th century, early 20th century America, when you had the same sort of, you know, post-depression issues of monopoly and competition. So I suppose I would want to say to people, the ball is in our hands. I think what there is a role for government and upholding freedom of the press and platforms that allow truth to be adjudicated on all of those issues of editorial responsibility and freedom of speech matters. Why do middle-class parents in China want to send their kids to study in Scotland? My academic colleagues would all say it's because of the fantastic education, and that's part of it. Yeah. But part of it is that if you can afford it, you want your children to be in a classroom where they can speak their mind freely. Freedom matters. And you see that in Hong Kong again this week. You see, you know, the Chinese would have you believe that ethnicity transcends boundaries, and actually Taiwan and Hong Kong say, no, there are people all over the world who want to be able to express themselves, and those sorts of fundamental values of free speech, whether they are in China, Hong Kong, the United States, Washington, D.C., are timeless and ones we should uphold.
It's a really important point in terms of democracy and equality and diversity within politics. Now, we're seeing more and more that overwhelmingly female politicians are leaving politics to strike a work-life balance. You have two twins yourself, which you've mentioned before. We also saw on the news last night politicians who are queuing round about Westminster 2 meters apart because we're not going to use digital technology because that's not a suitable way to conduct politics. Again, as an observer and someone that's been a politician, if we're to make politics more diverse, more inclusive, is technology a way to do that? Is there a way to balance work and life? It's a demanding job. If we are to see more female representation at the top, how might we do that, do you think?
So I think two things. So I did step back because I wanted to spend more time with the twins, and I haven't regretted that. I mean, I actually think the key issue is parenthood and not gender, or at least it should be parenthood. And by that, I mean, I did say how wonderful it was to see Kez and Ruth and Nicola all leading political parties, 3 women, and 2 of them being gay, none of them having children. Now that's at that stage. That is what I felt acutely. And lots of people manage it, and I admire that. But I think parenthood, you'll look at Jacinda parenthood means it is very hard to explain to a 2-year-old or a 12-year-old, my work is more important than you are. And people do it, and they find ways with supportive partners and with family support to cope with that. But I think the 24/7 demands of the media cycle are very tough for politicians who are trying to be committed parents to. And to the credit, some of the people who walked away or plan to walk away next year have been honest to own that. And the more we own it, the more, look, we had the first locum MP. I didn't even realise we'd had a locum MP. I thought locum GP, locum MP. We are making... You know, the Scottish Parliament itself was a huge advance. When the Scottish Parliament was set up, there had only been 10 ever Labour women MPs over, almost 80 plus years, and 2 of them. And at the time, I was reading this recently, there were 2 Labour women with kids, one who represented Peckham and one who represented Slough, I think. It was almost impossible to combine parenthood with or being the primary carer with, and people often find that with caring and elderly relatives too. So we have an issue about how do we combine the demands of the 24-hour news cycle with making political life easier. The fact Holyrood exists makes it easier. Of course, we should have better digital technology, and it will come. I mean, Parliament is it's behind the curve. The Scottish Government don't have enough Zoom licenses. They will fix it. In the same way, there's lots of people like me going, if I want more flexible working to let me work a little bit more from home, then I've got to enable that for every single other member of the workforce that I can who wants that. So I think the answer is it's coming, and I think both more flexibility in work, and I think digital technology enables that. I think we do have to think about how you interrogate politicians down the line. This because part of politics is probing for an answer when the politician doesn't want to give it for whatever reason. And we need to figure out a way that you can do that digitally, and we're not quite there yet, but it'll come.
We need to encourage more people from all backgrounds into politics, don't we, and have diverse representation. I was wondering, like, in terms of your trajectory into politics, you were born in Erskine and attended school there, and I was wondering how you got into politics. And classic question: if you were to write a letter to your younger self, what would you tell yourself? What would you learn? What would you do differently? Do you think, not just with politics, but with being a leader?
So how did I get into, I went to the Young Socialists at 16 with my best pal, who I'd known forever, whose dad worked in Linwood and was facing closure there. And it was just, it was in my DNA. It was the right thing to to do it the way somebody would join a debating club.
Yeah.
But I never stood for full-time elected office. I was 35, 38 before I stood for elected office, and I went and did other things. And I lived abroad a lot, which is partly now why I'm VP International. I loved seeing other cultures. And so I would advise you, yes, get involved, but get some life experience in, so that you're able to walk away. And indeed, sometimes in all political parties, it's a very insecure life. You know, the electorate vote you out. So my advice is, you know, find another life. And there is more than one way to serve. I spent a lot of time doing policy, which I enjoyed. I liked building alliances. And one of the sad things about Scottish politics is, if you're constantly, I mean, one of the reasons I didn't stay is that if you're constantly having a debate about the Constitution, if the country is split between whether you're going to leave or whether you're going to stay, I called it our Quebec phase. If you're in your Quebec phase where half want to stay and half want to go, broadly speaking, it's quite hard to build alliances to get other things done and across. And so diagnose the operating environment you like. And if you're not hugely aggressive and you don't like conflict, then maybe find a different operating space if it's a time of conflict rather than consensus building. And that's easier if you have a hinterland of other things that you can fall back on, move on to, be involved with. That said, the quickest and easiest way to change the world remains the political process. You know, fundamentally, Paris was about moving on the climate change issue. All those issues about how do we have a fairer world? How do we deal with the injustices in the South? How do we deal with lingering, issues on racism is lingering, but all the still untackled parts of the agenda around identity, all of that, politics allows you to change the law of the land, and we need good people who want to be involved in it. And I get slightly worried that we are kind of sniffy about people who get any political involvement. So every time you apply for a public body or serve on a board or be a trustee of a local charity, all those Nolan principles, they contrive to be slightly sniffy about people who express their political commitment in any way. And I think we lose something in that.
And with that, just thinking about the sector at the moment, it's going to be a challenge, and we need people who are driven. And I get exactly as you said, you have to be kind of like non-partisan within the sector. There's a campaign at the moment for the third sector, which is that we're never more needed within the sector. Do you think, from what you've seen as in your time in government and the third sector and communities and the economy, do you see that there is a bigger role for the third sector, but then also the traditional business sector getting more involved in civil society?
Yes, I mean, for people in the third sector, it's a hugely exciting time. There will be no going back to the old normal. There will be a new normal. And I think you're right that businesses are stepping up around the ESG agenda in a serious way. And people before talked about greenwash. And I think if we're honest, a lot of the emphasis in the near term has been on E for good reasons around climate change. But the S is firmly back on the agenda. How is every business treating their stakeholders, their employees, their suppliers? And also in the G and governance, are they open? Are they transparent? And actually employees, not just young employees, the millennials were doing it anyway, but actually across the spectrum, employees are demanding of employers both personal time to commit to the third sector and asking their business, what are we doing? And you will know more about this than I do, but there are ways in which the financial sector in Edinburgh has stepped up remarkably in recent weeks to say, how do I get alongside third sector organisations who are serving need at the moment, and we have, for example, a set of digital skills that we can bring to bear. So if I was to sum up, and I'm no expert in this, but the challenge for the sector is there will be some extraordinary financial challenges. That's just the realpolitik. Half the people listening to this call will be thinking, how do we balance the books next year? Or how do we make sure that the gap isn't so large we can continue to trade? And I would never diminish how challenging that process is. So that's the downside, you know, of just how do you stay solvent long enough to keep doing what you're trying to do? And own that, because the government can't own that on everybody's behalf. They're just, you know, one of the things of working in government is, you know, there's always a better call in the marginal pound, which may be, you know, the A&E or the hospital, but so there's a big challenge around solvency. But equally, how do you harness this extraordinary appetite from people of all walks of life to give? And one of the things that I've been aware of, you'll know this from growing up as well too, you know, in the 80s and 90s, when we had more organised hours and workplaces, people did give a lot more of their time in the evening to youth organisations, to church organisations. People left work at 4:30 or 5, and they gave to their community because they were able to do that, and more in a way that has become less common in a world of 0-hour contracts and extended hours and the expectation you'll work as long as it takes. And I detect there's a real rollback of people saying, I like spending time with my family. I want a different work-life balance. I'll sacrifice some income. I don't want to be on the fast-track promotion, or if that's what it takes, let's have a different track. So I think that harnessing that appetite of people to give and contribute and use their skills, and, you know, hopefully technology helps us get the matching function right in a way that it's always been challenging in the past.
Wendy, I've completely enjoyed speaking to you today. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your role and for what you have done with Social Investment Scotland and help pave the way. And also on, I guess, this Pride Month, for